Okay. So, when I was little, I spent a lot of time on the farm of my aunt and my uncle, where I observed like the daily farming business, but also structural changes like the construction of a slurry pit, the introduction of a milking system, the reconstruction of the barn into a loose barn, and the question of successionship. And for my dissertation, I wanted to understand what are the factors driving these decisions. As a social ecologist, I first have to explain you my perspective. Social ecology sees society and nature as coupled, interacting systems, and us humans in the middle, influenced by socio-cultural factors, but also by natural conditions, so our decision-making is influenced by that. I focused on mountainous areas because about 30% of the European Union and about 70% of Austria consist of mountainous areas. They are a biodiversity harbor, but also an anchor for cultural identity. And my study regions were in Austria and in France. I focused on climate change, on the long-term effects of climate change, like changes in yield projections, but also on short-term effects from extreme events that affect the harvest in 1 year. Like in this year, the apricot harvest was affected by a late frost event. As farmer in the European Union, you're of course confronted with the common agricultural policy and changes from it, but also with changes in societal preferences. So if the demand for organic produce increases, this of course also affects your decision making. So far we have a quite systemic framework with socio-economic changes, climate changes, and an agricultural production system. And I wanted to add the actor's perspective and study the decision-making of individual farms and the location factors, the intrinsic factors that affect this decision-making. And one way that allowed me to do so was agent-based modeling. Agent-based modeling was originally started in the 1970s in artificial intelligence research, and agents are embedded in an environment. They can learn and adapt, they're autonomous and self-directed, and their decision-making is led by characteristics and rules. For my dissertation, I developed the agent-based model Segland that mainly holds farm agents, and farm agents they differ by farm type, but also by their farming style. And the farming style represents the intrinsic motivation, the value system, something that affects the decision-making of farmers, besides the farming type. Farms in Segland, they seek well-being, and well-being is defined as a balance between income and workload. So whenever there is an imbalance between these two aspects or factors, farmers try to regain balance again, and they set their decisions accordingly. Segland then tracks land use change among 3 gradients: intensity changes, crop culture changes, but also like the forest transition, the transition away from agricultural land. And these changes on the land use are on the one side product from inner workings of the model, but also from external changes that affect the land use decisions. I investigated 3 recurring future scenarios: a business as usual scenario, a fossil growth scenario, and a sustainability scenario that I adapted specifically for each individual study region, but like the general outline I kept constant. I worked in interdisciplinary research teams, and I also did an evaluation of my results with regional stakeholders, where I presented and discussed results and scenario assumptions, but I also did farmer interviews to calibrate the decision-making of the model for each study region accordingly. The first paper was then written about the Enns Valley in Austria, and it was a general model description and a sensitivity analysis, and I asked the question, how do changes in income limit and workload limit and also the farming style affect land use patterns with a focus on grassland management? The second paper was for the French case study region Ariège, and there it was the question, can mountain pastures buffer the adverse effects of extreme events on fodder production? Short answer is yes, but there are important or vulnerable ecosystems in the mountains, like this little frog, that can be affected by that. The third paper brings us back to Austria, where I investigated for an East Austrian case study region, how can climate change adaptation work if you do not introduce an irrigation system? There are extreme events affected the decision-making of farms to introduce early climate change adaptation, but workload was a limiting factor. I wanted to address two different aspects of a research gap. I wanted to improve the understanding of intrinsic and extrinsic drivers of land use decision making, and I wanted to use my conclusions to make some recommendations to improve future policy, future land use policies. Recurring future trajectories were a decreasing number of farms independent of the case study region and the scenario, which highlighted the question of successorship and the ability to attract new farmers. For land use, there was an extensification and abandonment trend, and for climate change, it was important to differ between long-term effects that can be positive, like an extension of the growing season, and the short-term effects from extreme events that were always negative. In all, workload was an important factor, either it was for the well-being of farms, but also for land use decisions or like early climate change adaptation. I finally concluded that future agro-environmental schemes will have to equally consider environmental indicators such as trade-offs between food security and environmental pressure, but also social indicators, like for farmers having a family life or having time for free time for hobbies besides just being a farmer. I want to thank my supervisors, my advisory team, all my colleagues that I worked with in the project, and of course, my interview partners and stakeholders. And last but not least, I want to thank my son who lent me his chalk to draw all the slides. And I want to thank you for listening to me today. Thank you.